In the concluding pages of his autobiography, Why I Am Not an Atheist, Christopher Beha writes, quote, "If I'm right that the meaning of God is love, why not leave Jesus out of it? Why profess any beliefs on the man at all? Why not just stick with love?" The church's answer would be that humanity tried that already and that it didn't work. All I can say for myself is that I tried it and it didn't work for me. The Christian religion, Wittgenstein wrote, is only for the man who needs infinite help. Over many years, I have come to discover that I am that man. Close quote. Christopher Beha, on his sweeping spiritual autobiography, Why I Am Not an Atheist, The Confessions of a Skeptical Believer, now. My name is Todd Warner, and this is the Evangelization Culture Podcast from Word on Fire. Christopher Beha is the former editor of Harper's Magazine and the author of 4 previous books, including The Index of Self-Destructive Acts, which was nominated for the 2020 National Book Award. Chris, welcome.
Thanks so much.
Segment 1, The Beginning of the Troubles. In the opening pages of Why I Am Not an Atheist, Christopher Beha writes, quote, "When I was 15 years old, an angel of God came to me at night, pinned me to my bed, and demanded that I put my trust in the Lord. This was no dream. I was awake. I am as certain of that as I'm certain that I'm awake while I write these words, and a terrifying presence was communicating to me. I tried to escape, but my body wouldn't move. Through great effort, I finally yelled out, and my scream chased the presence away. My heart pounded as I caught my breath. Coming back to myself, I heard my twin brother Jim snoring peacefully in the bunk above." Close quote. So, Chris, this is right off the bat, the beginning of this book. This just leaps out at a reader, myself included. This wasn't your only visitation. Is that correct?
Yeah, this was the first in a series of similar visitations, experiences that I had over the course of many years, really, in my teens through my college years.
Can you just, I know the jarring nature of this first encounter was very apparent in what I just read. Until you started deciphering in your mind what you think this is and where you went with that kind of argument with yourself, what was it like to have these types of encounters repeatedly throughout your younger years?
Well, it was puzzling, and it was it gave me a sense, which I think a lot of people have at that age, regardless of being special, of being chosen in a certain way. Although, with it, this sense that chosenness was not something that was necessarily recognized by the world at large. It was something
Right.
that only I knew, something private. And in fact, I didn't talk about it with anyone at the time, and I didn't really talk about it with anyone later. And even when I decided I was going to write a book about my spiritual journey, and even after I wrote a proposal for this book and brought it to my literary agent and outlined the whole book for my editor and all of those things, I didn't think that this was really going to be a part of the story. And then I started writing, and I started really thinking about what I wanted to say about this journey, and it suddenly seemed like the place where I needed to begin, even though it was something that had remained over all these years, a deeply private occurrence.
Just for those of us who aren't, very acclaimed writers out there, which is the vast majority of our listeners here, putting this very, very intimate, very private, very special set of experiences out on the paper for everybody to read. Just say a word about kind of crossing that Rubicon. What's that been like for you as you come across it in every bookstore and people come up and ask you about it and I'm talking to you about it? Is it difficult to now have that be a very publicized aspect of your experience, or would you say no? It's hand in glove. It completely fits in with the narrative here, and I'm glad that I did that.
Well, that's an interesting question. So one thing I'll say, and I'm sure that you intended to get to this eventually, but you don't have to read many more pages into the book before you are offered what I would call a sort of rational materialist explanation for these occurrences. I came within a couple of years of this first incident to know that I suffered from something called sleep paralysis, which happens to many, many people at least once or twice in their lives, but some people have these chronic cases. And essentially, you come awake while your body is still in its REM sleep state. So your body is paralyzed, but you're awake. And often these are accompanied by visions and a sense of terror and sort of essentially a sense of the sublime, and all of it. And there is a physical neurological explanation for it. So I do get to that explanation fairly quickly, and it was an explanation. It was an explanation that for much of my adult life I accepted as the quote unquote correct explanation for it. I thought that it could be reduced to rational terms. And on that level, I think I am allowing a certain kind of reader, I suppose you could say, that out to interpret it that way. But I wrestle over it, and I continue to wrestle over it. At the time that it happened, I absolutely wholeheartedly believed that it was something outside of myself that had come. And I think there are at least some people at the time who, if I had expressed that belief with the kind of commitment with which I felt it, they would have thought I was a little nuts, basically. For whatever reason, that wasn't my concern while writing the book. I've operated for my entire adult life in what I guess one would call the sort of secular media world. I was the editor of a mainstream general interest, left of center, basically, magazine. My novels are published by a secular literary press. I write for places like the New York Times. But I have never felt embarrassed about my belief. I have never worried that people won't take me seriously or that people will think that I'm irrational or whatever. There were elements of the story that were a challenge to write about, for sure.
Yeah.
Some of the psychological difficulties that I went through. It was tough to write about some of my struggles with alcohol, for example, which is not something that I have talked about very much, despite the fact that that is the kind of thing, that's the kind of narrative that is quite explicable to people in all sorts of parts of the culture,
Yeah.
So those things I felt much more sort of anxious or hesitant about that sort of stuff than I did about saying, an angel came to me in my bed for whatever reason.
Yeah. We're going to also get into kind of the pools you swim in professionally in New York and the writing you do and so on, the editing you've done. Tell us a little bit about your Catholic upbringing. So this experience you had was kind of also housed in a family of believing and practicing Catholics. Just how would you, in a few words, how would you describe your upbringing in the Catholic faith?
Yeah, I had an upbringing that would probably be pretty culturally familiar to a decent number of your listeners. Anyone who grew up in like a northeastern city in a Irish Catholic family. Essentially, we were Irish and German Catholics, but it was my parents had both gone to Catholic schools in Manhattan growing up. They met when they were in high school at a Catholic school mixer, a dance between my mother's Catholic girls' school and my father's Catholic boys' school, and they married young. My mother was then a teacher at the Catholic girls' school where she'd gone and where my sister later went. My brother and I went to the school my father had gone to. We were, so both sides of my family were practicing Catholics going back as far back as anyone could remember. And it was not just a cultural marker, they were, I was surrounded by profound believers, and we structured our life around the church and around the local Catholic community, which meant the schools, but also meant it meant the church, and it meant my father was on the board of trustees at the Jesuit high school where he went, where I also later went, and we had Jesuit priests at the dinner table. We had members of the family who had joined orders, all of that. So it was a big part of the fabric and tapestry of our lives. A lot of the books on our shelves, both my parents and various members of my family were big readers, and readers of fiction in particular. And we would have more Graham Greene and Flannery O'Connor and Walker Percy and Francois Mauriac and Georges Bernanos than your average New York literary reader would have. That didn't mean we didn't also have Updike and Roth and Bellow, but there was a sense of there being being part of a distinctly Catholic culture. And I remember my grandfather would sometimes, if some person, some politician or some public figure came up in conversation, would say in this very knowing way, well, he's Roman. And I sometimes think of this distinction between a Roman and a Catholic. There's that double-barreled particularist and universalist name, Roman Catholicism, and I think of the being Roman as being, culturally Catholic and a member of a clan, essentially, and then being Catholic as being subscribing to a metaphysical and moral worldview. And I would say that you can be one without the other, as I understand it. And I came from a family that was very much both.
We come across a part early in the book where you write, I was 18 when my doubts began. So, Chris, what happened?
Well, a few things happened. I went off to college, and I did not go to a Catholic college. I went to a secular college, but likely a lot of this would have happened much in the same way, regardless. But I got to an age where you naturally start to question the beliefs in which you've been raised. You start looking around at other options. But the more sort of distinctive thing that happened is that my twin brother, the month we arrived on campus, was hit by a car and almost died. And it was a incredibly jarring, to say the least, thing. He survived and eventually came to flourish, and he's still doing well. But there was a moment where we really thought we were going to lose him, and I was sort of faced with essentially the problem of suffering that every believer eventually has to face in some way or another. And as I write in the book, the perhaps ironic thing is that, when the accident happened, the first thing we all did, my family, was to pray that he would be all right. And he was. So in that sense, our prayers were answered. And so that seems like a funny first step away from belief. But in seeing how close we'd come to the truly devastating and catastrophic outcome. I became acutely aware of the fact that that outcome was occurring all over the world all the time. That we'd been saved from a certain amount of suffering, but that suffering existed, and it might as easily have come to us as anyone else. And I also felt very strongly that it couldn't be the case that our prayers were the reason we'd been spared, because that there were plenty of people who were more devout than we were, who were, better, more deserving people than I was, who were not spared in that way. And even if it was just a hierarchy like that, that seemed perverse to me, that God was picking and choosing on an individual basis. I'll give the suffering to this person and not that person because that person's praying, etc. So it just starts to raise a lot of questions, a lot of very challenging questions. These were questions that, having gone to a Jesuit high school, I'd actually had been posed to me in a classroom setting in theology classes well before this incident. But there's a big difference between working through things intellectually in a classroom and having them presented to you in this existential fashion by the events of your life.
Yeah. This is, again, a very honest book, not only in your deep philosophical searches, but also some of the trials that you went through. We talk about the diagnosis of Hodgkin's lymphoma. You also talk about depression and the use of drugs and alcohol. Obviously, these are big and very deep topics. But could you say a few words? Again, you're a young guy going through a lot of these trials that kind of shiver the timbers of faith. Let's start with the depression and some of the drugs and the alcohol. What tell us about that and how that kind of weighed in on your search, if you will.
Yeah, well, I mean, I drank a lot in college, but I drank a lot in high school too, to be honest. Before these challenges happened, and I was just as if a lot of my life was lived in this family cultural milieu where certain things were natural. I had a social milieu as a teenager into my 20s where a lot of drinking was very natural. Frankly, that may also be part of the Irish Catholic part of it. But just in general, like, I got into college and I was around people where this seemed the natural way to behave. But everyone's doing it for different reasons, and I had part of it for me was really a way to manage what I could only describe as an existential dread. I, part of that coming from my brother's accident, and then that being followed up shortly after, as you alluded to, by my own diagnosis of Hodgkin's lymphoma, which was stage 3 when it was diagnosed. So I was, had real concerns about my own survival. And again, I ultimately got the best outcome I could have hoped for. But it really terrified me. And I became deeply afraid of death at the same time that I was starting to adopt a worldview that that really did tell you that your physical death was the end for you. But not only that, but that had an explanation for the widespread embrace of what was fundamentally irrational and insupportable religious and metaphysical beliefs. The explanation for this was precisely a fear of death. This is something that, goes back to a philosopher like David Hume in the early Enlightenment. But in more recent years, someone like Bertrand Russell, who is a touchstone in this book, who wrote a famous work himself called "Why I'm Not a Christian," that my title is alluding to. Russell says fear is the basis of the whole thing. The reason people believe is out of fear. They're afraid that they're at the mercy of nature, at the mercy of forces larger than themselves, and they're afraid of death. And so they tell themselves a story, and that story involves there being some magic power that's going to let them survive death. A story that they have these souls that are something other than their bodies or apart from their bodies that might continue living after their bodies die. They tell the story that all these uncontrollable forces of nature are themselves at the control of this much larger force, and that it is possible to win this force's favor, to supplicate yourself to this force, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the way I was coming to understand the beliefs in which I'd been raised, which before then I had really embraced entirely. At the same time, I was coming to understand them at the same time that these fears were in fact becoming much more acute for me, which was an odd kind of paradox. So the fact of these fears made me, if anything, accept even more strongly the explanation for religion that says it's a response to these fears. So now I have the fears, and I don't have the response to the fears that I had once had. And I feel like it would be giving in somehow to allow yourself that comfort. And the result was just an extreme psychological distress, essentially. I had enormous levels of anxiety. I had profound depression. And I managed a lot of that by way of drugs and alcohol, essentially.
The opening, kind of the beginning of your search, you do such a nice job of introducing Bertrand Russell and what he wrote. You also talk about the new atheists, that right around this time, the Christopher Hitchens, the Richard Dawkins, the Sam Harrises are emerging on the scene, and they're kind of brash, and they're articulate, and they're charismatic in their kind of unapologetic approach to the notion that, here's all the troubles with faith. Just say a couple words. In addition to Bertrand Russell, what do the new atheists say to you, or how do they speak to you in the midst of this as well?
Well, it's important to give this bit of context first. So I should say that I graduated from college in 2002. So 9/11 occurred the fall of my senior year. So that's the time when all of these events are unfolding for me personally. Right. And that was that context is absolutely essential to understanding these figures, the so-called new atheists, who are roughly it's Christopher Hitchens, it's Sam Harris, it's Daniel Dennett, and it's Richard Dawkins. And they all came from slightly different positions. Hitchens was a literary journalist and sort of rabble-rouser. Harris was a doctoral student in neuroscience, but he basically launched himself entirely as a polemicist against religion. Dennett was a well-respected philosopher who already had a long career behind him. And Dawkins was similarly a well-respected ethologist, biologist, evolutionary biologist who had a long career behind him. And Dennett and Dawkins already had popular audiences as sort of explainers, explicators of their kind of narrow academic fields. But Sam Harris, immediately after 9/11, he would say later he started writing the book on September 12th, 2001, wrote this book called The End of Faith that was essentially an argument for why religion was going to destroy the world. You had on the one hand Islamic terrorists, radical Islam. You had on the other hand, in America, the force that was fighting it was the avatars of that was George W. Bush, John Ashcroft, a lot of evangelical Christians who, as Harris would say, were then framing their response to these Islamic terrorists as a clash of religions. and that all of this was taking us down the road to apocalypse, essentially. And Harris's primary argument wasn't just that religion was false and that it was bad for us, et cetera, but that we gave it too much respect. That the liberals, who ought to be the proper alternative to these two things, were too driven by a sense of essentially freedom of religion, and we're allowing the circulation of these dangerous beliefs without giving them the kind of rational scrutiny that other beliefs got. And that, almost more than anything, became the argument of the new atheists at large, which is it's time to stop being so nice to religion. There were already plenty of unbelievers, but the tone of we're gonna really take this stuff apart, and we're not going to be polite about it. People have been too polite for too long, but this stuff is dangerous. It's not just wrong, but it's pernicious, and we've got to really go after it. That was essentially the view of the new atheists. But they all came at it from slightly different angles, based on their background. But it was all very attractive, I think, to young men who were roughly in my position, sort of well-educated young men who considered themselves a little bit smarter than everyone else, who wanted to be able to be in arguments with people and win those arguments and have the sort of withering, sarcastic response, etc. For all that, they didn't really speak to me, and the primary reason they didn't speak to me was that I was not actually looking to talk myself out of belief. I was already out of it. Nor was I especially looking to convince anyone else. I didn't feel like I needed to go back into my, the friends I'd gone to Catholic school with and talk them out of belief, or try and talk my parents out of belief. Nobody was trying to argue me back into faith. I wasn't hearing it from my parents. This is what, they were actually taking a step back in a way that I've come only more and more to appreciate as I've become a parent myself. They were, I think they prayed for me, but they were willing to let me take the time to work this stuff out myself, So anyway, the upshot is I didn't need to win fights. What I needed to do was sort things out for myself. And the thing I needed to sort out was not whether or not I believed, but how I was going to live in the absence of belief. And
by the way, that dominates the book. Yes. That question in the best of ways. How am I to live?
And so that they didn't have much to say on that point, which is not even a criticism of them, in the sense that it wasn't their project. It wasn't what they were looking to do. But the result was that those were not the books for me, even though that was the natural starting place at that time for someone who was in my position.
Given the Jesuits that were coming to your place, the books on the shelves, the practice of your family's faith, and so on and so forth, and obviously given the kind of traumas and tragedies you experienced with your brother's injury, your own dealing with cancer, the fact that you live in Manhattan and 9/11 happens in Manhattan, the proximity of this tragedy.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say I knew 3 or 4 people who close to my age, in their 20s, who died that day. So it was a big thing.
We're going to talk for the next 2 segments about the philosophical deep dive you went on. Was there part of you that ever approached any of the people that are, the high school theology teacher that you enjoyed, a professor from college that you kept in touch with, a Jesuit priest or a local priest who's steeped in the intellectual tradition of the Catholic faith? Was there ever part of you that said, I'm going to retread this ground, go back here and talk to those or explore those ideas out of the Catholic intellectual tradition, just to really kind of approach this in a not a heady, but in a serious way, to grapple with these serious questions along the lines of my moral theology I took when I was in high school or what have you? Or was your sense that, you know what? I'm already stepping away from that. I'm already drawn to the what Russell had to say, and I'm going to do this deeper dive in the philosophical side of things. I'm just curious, was there that part of you that wanted to go back, but go back in a deeper, heavier way on the Catholic intellectual tradition? Or was it like, no, I was a little bit too far gone at that point, so that it was the more traditional philosophical path I found myself on?
There might have been some part of me. I went and spoke with one of the Jesuits not about here are my questions, here are my dilemmas, what is the church's answer to this, but just saying I'm going to stop going to church. I'm not feeling like this is where I belong right now, and perhaps I went to him hoping to be talked out of it or something, but much in keeping with what I said about my parents, his response was, well, okay, that sounds like a reasonable thing for someone your age to do. And he told me a story that, this is only the Jesuits, but he said, yeah, I stopped going to church right around your age too. And I stopped going for 2 years. And then I came back, and a year after that, I joined the order. And that's all he said. But his point was not, you'll be back eventually. His point was just, these are your questions to answer. And I think he's like, you're asking the right questions. But I wasn't asking him to answer the questions for me. And so he said, all right, go out there and see what you can find. I was aware, obviously, in a way that not everyone is, of the existence of this whole tradition, and I was aware that it was a meaningful one. There is if you read, for example, the New Atheists, they will essentially, there is a school of thought, for example, that basically says that from the sort of later Stoics or the Neoplatonists or something like that, until you get to about Bacon and Descartes, serious thought stopped happening. That everything that happens in between is all just under the sway of the limits of this force, the Catholic Church. I obviously didn't believe that. And I understood the power of Augustine. I understood the power of Aquinas. But it wasn't where I was going to look for answers at that moment. Yeah. I wanted to know what the secular answers were.
Segment 2, Crooked Lines. In Why I Am Not an Atheist, Christopher Beha writes, quote, "My journey is now nearly 3 decades old. Given this book's title, it would be pointless to withhold the fact that it has led me to an outright rejection of atheism, and I might as well get out of the way the fact that it eventually led me back to the Catholic Church, albeit in a very different relationship from the one I had as an adolescent altar boy. I want to tell the story of my own passage into and out of atheist belief by telling the story of the books I read along the way and the worldviews that I worked my way through," close quote. So, Chris, as you know, having written it, what ensues is a riveting 400-page treatment of the philosophical schools of thought that you browsed, that you tried on, that you returned to the rack before advancing further in your queries and your understanding. So I said this to you offline beforehand, but first, I'm a pretty voracious reader, but I am stunned at the volume of books you read, and especially the dense nature of the material with which you wrestled. So I want to just on the matter of just what you've achieved in not only writing this book, but in doing all the work that led to it. Could you begin by estimating how many books you conquered in your search and how long it took? And then I want to know, what did you do for a palate cleanser between Hume and Kant, Heidegger and Camus? So your thoughts.
Well, I mean, honestly, I think the number of books is in the thousands. I mean, I'm someone who reads certainly more than 100 books a year, and have been that way for a long time. It's just it's what I spend a lot of time doing. And what I was doing, because I'm a novelist, and it's always been my ambition to be a novelist. I should say that at the same time that I was reading all these works of philosophy, I was also trying to give myself a serious education in the history of the novel. So I was reading a lot of Henry James and Tolstoy and George Eliot and all of that. But I was, as far as like a palate cleanser goes, I guess it was the novels, but I love reading, and I love the reading that seriously engages me, that engages my full intellect and the fullness of myself. Even the novels I read are mostly those kinds of novels, So it felt urgent to me. I was reading it. I wasn't. It's important to me that, so I wound up ultimately writing this book that does sort of make clear what I have read. But that wasn't my intention when I was reading it. There's a lot of talk in the culture right now about quote unquote performative reading. And there is a sense of like a certain kind of person, usually a younger male of the sort I was then, who reads a particular kind of very literary, experimental, challenging novel, on the subway or in the coffee shop, where they can be seen doing it, and that there's a performance to it and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I wasn't around people who cared what I was reading, really. But in any case, it wasn't a matter of display, and I wasn't trying to check books off a list. It wasn't peak bagging. I was really trying to figure out the truth. And I really did think that this was the best way to do it. That's one. And then two, and this, I think, is more a matter of disposition, I guess, than anything else. But I found it fun. I found it like a kind of adventure, I really like the way that philosophy tests my brain, I think that, in particular, I think, as both when I was an unbeliever and as a believer, I am very moved towards something like an apophatic kind of mystical view of the truth as being something that, if not being beyond our powers of expression and comprehension, are right at the edge of it, And the thing that you get when reading Kant or Wittgenstein, or I find Heidegger, although some people might disagree, but is a sense that you're working very, very hard because you're really stretching your mind right to the edges of the comprehensible. But that is the thing you have to do, that stretching, in order to actually start to feel like you're approaching the truth. And at the same time, you would say that these people are difficult to read, not because they're, bad academic writers, and not because they're putting up a smokescreen to try and cover up the fact that they don't have anything to say, but because they themselves are trying to express something that is right at the limits of the expressible, So that always, anytime you get into that sort of territory, whether in the secular or the religious world, or into the quasi-mystical territory, or there are opportunities for people who are for fakery, for the people who don't have anything to say but are good at dressing up their nothing in this kind of language. And there are always going to be some people who don't understand it and pretend they do. And there's also always going to be some people who don't understand it and respond by saying, everyone who claims to understand it is pretending they do. This is all, the emperor has no clothes, etc. But for me, there is something there, and that work of getting there feels both existentially urgent and actually like an exciting adventure and like fun, basically. So it's a
Yeah.
very different kind of fun than most people recognize, spending an entire day just reading 50 pages of the Critique of Pure Reason. But that's the way my brain works.
It's amazing though, and the great thing about this is, you think about the way you've been propelled kind of through your search and ultimately arriving back at faith. I mean, it was like you said, it was existential dread.
Yeah.
It was, I mean, all these dark, I mean, the whole notion of, what's the grace that comes out of suffering. And I'm not trying to say, haha, let's pronounce it as this, but one can say that, the accident your brother went through, the cancer you experienced, the getting lost in depression with alcohol and drugs, the existential dread, it spurred you. It spurred you, and then you were, sort of the motive force. You were spurred, but simultaneously there was that calling to your what you've described as a literary vocation, but also that calling to, I'm enjoying this.
Yes.
I'm enjoying these epiphanies I'm having along the way, and I'm building off of things, and I'm discarding some things as I bring something else into the fold here, and I totally get that. And I think, frankly, that's why a lot of young guys, especially young guys, are finding their way into some of these headier thinkers that speak a little bit contrary to the culture in this way or that way, for good or for ill sometimes. But they say, I need something better and bigger to chew on, and it does have a sense of urgency.
Yeah, and a lot of philosophy, religious and secular philosophy, quite openly presents itself in that way. And if you read, going back to Montaigne, but I mentioned Hume. Hume is a really fascinating figure who is, like, in many ways the patron saint, if you can put it that way, of the new atheists. He's one of the first Western philosophers who's really pretty openly hostile to religion, and he believes that there is a kind of consolation that comes from philosophy, for the fact that basically, these consolations offered by religion are not true. But the Spinoza, who comes just slightly before Hume, has the famous line about, it is the tendency of reason to view things under the species of eternity, subspecies eternitatis. And one of the things that the best of secular philosophy offers that makes it similar to religion is a sense that, really, it's almost, you could put it in terms of finding a kind of unity with the logos, but this idea that you can participate in human reason, in this large thing that is larger than yourself, and all of the fears and pains and trials of your life, you can transcend them somehow, by thinking hard about these abstract questions and participating in this tradition that thinks about them, and in this process somehow kind of unify yourself with this thing that is larger than you, that is human reason.
Chris, I wanted to talk about some of these ideas, because again, this is an absolute tour de force philosophical unfolding as you read. I mean, if those of you out there listening, if you read some philosophy, there's an incredible distillation of and engagement with these various philosophers. Scientific materialism was a dominant theme during a good amount of your search. Just tell our listeners, what does that mean? Who are its champions? And what kind of hold did it have on you to begin with?
So scientific materialism is the version of atheism that many people would just kind of call atheism. Atheists themselves will say atheism isn't a worldview. It is simply the denial of these theistic worldviews. And in fact, I think that is true. There are many, many different ways of being atheist. And it does not, to say I'm an atheist, does not entail a particular alternative worldview. But there are a handful of dominant atheist worldviews, and I don't think it is possible to live without a worldview. I don't think there's any, there is a position that is just sort of the common sense neutral view of the person who sees the world clearly versus everyone else has their constructed worldview. So the worldview that we generally associate in the modern age with atheism is scientific materialism. And it's materialist in the sense that it believes that physical matter is all that exists. And it is scientific in the sense that it believes that the way to gain knowledge about this physical material reality is through the methods roughly of the sciences, which basically means through observation, prediction, experimentation. It also believes that because reality is an object, physical reality is objectified, that our goal in gaining knowledge is to gain objective knowledge. It is to transcend our point of view, our emotions, all of the things that we as individuals bring to our observation to arrive at an observation that any other person from a different vantage point would recognize. And the main way we do that is through quantification, basically, is through treating different things as fungible units and being able to use the objective methods of mathematics to study them. And a few things follow from that. One is that, sorry, I'm just going to start that over.
Sure.
A few things follow from that. One is that anything that can't be fit into that schema, anything that cannot be objectified in that way, is treated as fundamentally unreal. And then another thing that follows from that is an ethic that is roughly utilitarian. It deals in consequences, in outcomes from actions, because those are things that can be studied objectively. It tries to make different goods commensurate. It deals in quantification and comparison and experimentation, just as other forms of knowledge do. So this is a tradition that has its origins in the empiricists, in people like John Locke and David Hume, and develops from there by way of and also I should mention Thomas Hobbes, a kind of proto-empiricist who was one of the first modern materialists who really thought physical stuff is all there is. And then it goes through, people like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, who brought in this ethic of utilitarianism. And one of the great 20th century avatars of the tradition is Bertrand Russell, whom I mentioned. And then it gets into, most of that is essentially the default position of the culture at large now. Even people who don't subscribe to it because they are religious believers, or for whatever other reason, when they get into the public square, they tend to do honor to it by making that the terms of the debate. When you are having a political argument with someone who doesn't share your faith, the common ground you both are going to come to is more or less a utilitarian ethic and more or less a sense of a materialist metaphysic. If you are reading a newspaper or a magazine that is not an explicitly religious one, the assumptions undergirding various arguments that are being made are going to be these scientific materialist arguments. That is what I think most of us basically consider the default, quote unquote, secular worldview.
This is, by the way, and I meant to mention this earlier, this is you kind of talk about Charles Taylor, Catholic philosopher Charles Taylor's perspective about subtraction stories. The stories that assume the world's default reality is simply the residual that's left when the supernatural is kind of bled out. Is that a fair thing? I mean, am I reaching too far?
No. This is for men. So Taylor, who is obviously a incredibly interesting thinker and has been hugely influential for me, he uses that subtraction story framework both on the historical level and on the personal level. And he says that on the historical level, the story that sort of theorists of secularization tell is that there is a neutral common sense reality that that exists for people naturally, which basically is materialism, scientific materialism. And that secularization is a process of, yes, stripping away this other stuff, this sort of superstructure of the spiritual or metaphysical to just reveal this thing underneath. And he says that's not, as a historical matter, what happened. What happened was this other worldview was constructed, and only once it was constructed was it possible for it to displace the other one.
Yeah.
But he says that in addition to that historical story being told, many people tell stories on individual levels, including about themselves, that involve having been raised in some faith and then having the scales fall from their eyes, or that the assumptions of that faith removed, and them coming to just sort of see reality as it actually is, that reality being the reality of scientific materialism. And again, he argues that that's not what happens. What happens is you sort of move from one worldview, constructed worldview, to another constructed worldview, often because you're leaving one community for another, or something like that. I agree with Taylor on those points. And my own situation was roughly that I was not coaxed from one worldview to another. What happened was the worldview I was in came to seem unconvincing or uncompelling or incomplete to me. And now I found myself sort of spiritually homeless. I didn't have somewhere else that felt natural to me. So I did not experience it as a subtraction story in the sense that it was like, oh, I don't believe in the claims of the Catholic Church anymore, but now having moved those out of the way, I can just see what the truth is. That is basically the version of the story that the new atheists tell, which is part of the reason why they're not engaged in the questions of, okay, well, if we don't believe in God, what do we believe instead? They say, no, we don't have beliefs. We have the facts. We have evidence. And people who take that view, that basically say that there is a common sense evidentiary reality that any rational person who has not been brainwashed by faith can be brought to subscribe to. People who that believe the reality they're talking about is the reality of scientific materialism. And those kinds of atheists are almost invariably scientific materialists. Although I should say that doesn't account for all scientific materialists. There are people who ascribe to the worldview, well, more or less understanding it to be a worldview, or at least understanding that it is not simply commonsensically true.
I love this whole, there is such a sales job of the notion that is the default, that everything else is built upon that. But if you just, again, bleed it out, if you rinse it off, at the end of the day, we can all agree that this is the reality, and this other stuff is, you might arrive there or what have you, but this is, and in fact, like you said, it is its own alternatively constructed notion of things that has then just been sort of kind of, I don't know, lacquered in and kind of with the, with all the putty and so on to say, no, this is always been there. That's just where things are,
evolutionary thinking, for example, is a very important part of scientific materialism. And that's an example of something, right? Some forms of evolutionary thinking had always existed, right? But it really took the view of natural selection and random variation combined with a certain kind of evolutionary thinking to really develop into, and so there was a new way of seeing the world that hadn't existed before. And so if you are someone who ascribes that view, you can say, once it's been properly explained to you, it's tough to unsee it, but it didn't always exist, right? The funny thing about materialism is that it has always existed. You go back to the pre-Socratics, right? There have always been some people who argue physical stuff is all there is, right? And it has not been a popular view for most of human history, not because of the church trying to squash it, because it existed. It existed and was not popular before the church existed. It existed among essentially irreligious thinkers without being popular. The reason it was not popular is that it doesn't make very much sense. I mean, I hesitate to put it in such stark terms because I don't claim to have a sort of a monopoly on the truth, as I've been trying to say. But the idea that our subjective experiences aren't real, or that they can be wholly reduced to objective events in the physical world, that doesn't really make sense. And the existence of mind has been a problem for materialism forever. And in fact, even when Hobbes introduces materialism, reintroduces materialism, the people who come immediately after him, like Locke and Hume, they reintroduce a kind of dualism where they have an account of the way that experience works, that our senses take in experiences, and that our mind has this storehouse of ideas, and that the idea and the thing itself are not the same thing. This eventually leads to from Hume into Kant and this idea that there is our mind is sort of ordering all of reality, and eventually can go from materialism all the way to idealism, which is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. But the reason that they're introducing this kind of dualism between the material and the ideational is because they know that the argument that Hobbes is making, that our experiences are just, as he puts it, motions in our body. It doesn't make sense. There's something missing there.
Yes. This is so years ago. I'm sure you read this. There was a big debate going on across the pages. I think the London Review of Books or the New York Review of Books or elsewhere, surrounding it was Leon Wieseltier and Steven Pinker. And it was the notion of can science purify the humanities? I think there was 3 different back and forth across these pages. And this is just the notion of, I think Pinker was advocating the notion that, science is master, and it can basically break down a novel by Baudelaire or Tolstoy or whoever it may be, and it can render opinions on evolutionary phenotyping and all these kind of things. And Wieseltier just kind of shook his head and was like, what can evolutionary phenotyping tell me about the difficult relation between a man and his father? I mean, the notion that the sum is greater than its parts. And I think in my practice of medicine, I'm a generalist. I'm an internal medicine doc, and I have a lot of very good specialists I work with. The trap for the specialist is sometimes to get so siloed and so reductionist to break down the human experience to their own component part. They lose the bigger picture. And in fact, the bigger picture, to my way of living and experiencing, is the sum is always greater than its parts. And so that's why, when you're describing this, I know you're going into the very deeper kind of philosophical world that is, to me, a little bit daunting. But I also will say, when I read some of what you're describing in these chapters, I'm like, but that's not the way it is. And that's where that's I mean, like you said, am I being trite or am I being oversimplifying or what have you? But the common sense, that the gestalt, that sense of the way it is by your own experience, which I'm not saying that should be the ultimate metric. We got biases and blind spots and all that, but there's something to be said about the notion, as I think it was Edith Stein I don't know if she was reading Saint Teresa of Avila, when she finishes, she says, "I know this is true. I know this comports with what I understand as an experience." So any reflection on
well, what's
thoughts?
interesting about that, right, is that materialism, by being scientific, right, it begins by almost definitionally saying that those forms of knowledge aren't legitimate.
Exactly.
So it says, no, our emotions, our intuitions, our hopes, those are things that we need to set aside if we want to gain knowledge. Why? Because knowledge is perforce knowledge about objective reality, because objective reality is all there is. Now, why is objective reality all there is? Well, because objective reality is all that we discover when we remove all these other ways of knowing that I've just said we can't accept. Now, there's obviously something circular there,
Exactly.
To the credit of many materialists, scientific materialists, they would grant that point. That is to say, what scientific materialism entirely lacks, and what arguably all worldviews lack, but what it entirely lacks is an underlying solid foundation, right? You have to start with the view that matter is all there is. That can't be proven. That's not a thing you can prove, in part because you need to be in a worldview before you even have a sense of what is or is not a proof, what sorts of evidence is allowed to be brought into the argument. So once you're inside this closed circle of scientific materialism that says matter is all there is, therefore all knowledge must be knowledge of matter, therefore the proper way to gain knowledge is through objectification, etc. Once you're in that closed circle, it can, for many people, be reasonably convincing, but you cannot get there from first principles.
Right.
Again, that is something that many materialists will grant. They will say, "Well, you don't." What they often will argue is this is where a kind of argument of expediency or consequentialism comes in, which is, of course, again, precisely the ethic that their worldview allows. But they will say, science has gotten us all this good stuff, right? Back when the church was in charge, you had the plague and you had lifespans that were, roughly into your 30s, and you had this level of infant mortality, and you had this level of starvation, and you had, science gets you the polio vaccine. Science gets you air conditioning. Science gets you a rocket to the moon. So there's our first principles, and that's an argument that actually goes back to the very origins, because that's the argument that Francis Bacon makes. When Francis Bacon says knowledge is power, what he means by that is not just it is a powerful thing to have knowledge. He means that how you define what knowledge is it is the power to act in the world. That empiricism doesn't need a metaphysical underpinning. What it has is the ability to improve our lives, and for the ability to master nature, and also to master others, the ability for those who have the knowledge to become the masters, and those who don't to become the servants.
This book has so many great deep dives and great philosophers. I'm just going to list a few of them, but then I'm going to focus on three that I want you to reflect on. So we have Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, Friedrich Nietzsche, Martin Heidegger, among many. And also the questions that you delve into, the credibility of the material versus the immaterial, the trustworthiness of cause and effect, the nature of consciousness, utility and progress, the debate between agency and determinism, and all surrounding and pointing towards the proper way to live and to live with one another. I guarantee when everybody reads this book, they are going to find a primer. But what's even more, it's not a sterile, dissertation on philosophers. It's your engagement in the search for the greater truth of God, but also the greater truth of how am I to live in the face of this world we're living in which existential dread, anxiety, depression, trauma all dominates left and right. And so it's just an extraordinary personal exploration. I wanted to highlight three before we go to our last segment. I want to highlight three philosophers that struck me as having, as you would describe, a kind of more profound impacts on you. One is John Stuart Mill. The other is Arthur Schopenhauer. And the third is Ludwig Wittgenstein. And so John Stuart Mill, you wrote, when I first read Mill's autobiography as an undergraduate, it didn't leave much of an impression on me. I returned to it in my late 20s, and this time I found it thoroughly shaking. Mill's work complicated the picture for me, and I came to see his own breakdown and recovery as one of the clearest arguments against the ethic with which he is so closely associated. Could you say a few words about Mill and his impact on you, Chris?
Sure. The first thing to know about Mill, for those who don't know much about him, is that he was the son of another major thinker, James Mill. James Mill was an acolyte of Jeremy Bentham. Bentham was the modern founder of utilitarianism, although it was John Stuart Mill who actually gave Benthamism that name. But essentially, Jeremy Bentham was an English lawyer who wanted to reconfigure the Byzantine English legal code, and essentially hit on this view that our systems of social incentives, but also by extension our very view of right and wrong, needed to be rationalized. We needed to remove, again, our sense of emotion, these strong feelings of the need for justice and retribution. And instead, we needed to think about what kind of behavior would bring about, as a consequence, the most pleasure for the most people and the least pain, and how we could make it in people's own interests, because he believed all people fundamentally acted in their self-interest to maximize their own pleasure and minimize their own pain. So we needed to make it in people's individual self-interest to act in pro-social ways. So if you inflicted pain on others, we were going to punish you by inflicting a pain on you that exceeded whatever pleasure you got from inflicting that pain. And the upshot was you wouldn't do it, and that would be a net benefit to society. But we weren't going to do that because we thought there was something quote unquote immoral about your inflicting pain on other people. We were going to do it because ultimately there was a social benefit to doing it. So Bentham, believed in organizing life along rational lines, and he believed that all people were fundamentally self-interested, and he believed that we needed to remove emotion from the way we thought about how we treated other people and their behavior. James Mill was one of his acolytes, one of the people who made Benthamism a major cause in late 18th, early 19th century England in particular. And he decided to raise his son, John Stuart, among radical utilitarian lines. And he gave him this amazing education where he started, he taught him, ancient Greek when he was 3 years old, and he was reading Platonic dialogues. And he basically sat next to his father and just got this education throughout his life. He probably was among the most learned men who ever lived, John Stuart Mill. He was also, as he said in his biography, one of the only men of his generation who had not shucked off religion but had never had it. His father had actually trained for the ministry before falling under Bentham's sway, but had abandoned religion by the time he was raising him. So Mill was raised largely with, I think, the assumptions of a modern secular rationalist, certainly to a larger degree than probably any other person growing up in that time period. He was raised with those assumptions. And he was raised with a kind of mission, which was to universalize those assumptions. He was raised with the mission of reorganizing society along utilitarian lines. And when he was a fairly young man, he had a breakdown. He had a mental breakdown, and he became suicidal. And essentially, the origin of that breakdown was the realization that ultimately achieving this mission would not give him any pleasure. And the circularity of utilitarianism, as he recognized it, was that it valorized pleasure in the most basic sort of physical pleasure, hedonistic pleasure, as the greatest good. But it did not tell you what would give you pleasure, let alone what ought to give you pleasure. It didn't deal in oughts in that sense, right? But he found that happiness in that sense, pleasure in that sense, was one of those self-negating goals, in the sense that if you set out to live a hedonistic life, if your goal was just to give yourself the most pleasure, you weren't going to get it, because that isn't how one actually pursues pleasure. One pursues pleasure. One gets pleasure in pursuing some goal that is larger than that, and the pleasure comes as a kind of byproduct. So he really identified, although he modified his utilitarianism, but he remained a utilitarian all his life. But he really identified, as he came out of this breakdown, what for me was the great crux of what I was working through.
Yeah, very good. Arthur Schopenhauer, you exclaimed, quote, "I want to give a sense of how urgently Schopenhauer's work speaks to the most important human questions," close quote. Tell us about how Schopenhauer moved you.
Well, one thing about Schopenhauer is he's a wonderful writer. And for someone who is a literary reader, that matters. I've spoken about the fact that some of these thinkers are not very inviting stylists. But he is. He's a fantastic writer. He is one of the most pessimistic philosophers who ever lived in terms of his worldview. But what is so bracing about him is that he fully sees the implications of it. Schopenhauer, it's slightly difficult to describe Schopenhauer outside of a larger context of his response to Immanuel Kant, but essentially he believes that all of life is a kind of irrational, throbbing life force that is will. We are all embodied will, but it is not just human beings who are will, or not just the animal world that is will, but it is, the tree root pushing itself into the rock that is will. Everything in life that is in motion, trying to fill space occupied by something else, trying to grow and expand, trying to take in resources from others, fighting for its little bit of existence, share of existence, is will. And he believed in a way that was heavily influenced by Eastern thought. He was one of the first Western philosophers to seriously read Eastern thought. That all of our suffering was a result of this will. And that the suffering was the natural result of will, because will meant battling other things. It meant being in a constant fight. So his worldview entailed, or his ethic entailed, a kind of negation of the will. He said that our goal should be essentially, through really a quasi-mystical, spiritualistic kind of contemplative life, to try and escape this sort of throbbing fight of will.
And finally, Ludwig Wittgenstein, you write, quote, "To one of the propositions in the book's last pages, Wittgenstein adds a parenthetical, quote, 'Ethics and aesthetics are one,' close quote." You could say, this is you writing again, you could say that the proper answer to the question of why to go on living could be shown to us by someone who lives an exemplary life. But these people can never tell us their answer, because their answer is their life. Quote, "There is indeed the inexpressible," Wittgenstein says. "This shows itself. It is the mystical," close quote. Chris, tell us about Wittgenstein's impact on you.
Well, Wittgenstein is a fascinating figure because he is, in many ways, a culmination of both of these traditions. The other tradition, which we haven't talked about besides scientific materialism, is romantic idealism. And this is the tradition that Schopenhauer is a key figure in. And a lot of these figures, like Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche and the existentialists, the scientific materialists don't have a lot of time for. These are not people, the kinds of atheists that a Christopher Hitchens or a Daniel Dennett will be citing in their work. They will cite Hume, or they'll cite Bertrand Russell. Now, Wittgenstein was a student of Russell's. They worked together very closely, and Russell considered Wittgenstein the person who was going to extend and complete Russell's work. And essentially what that work was fully clarifying a system of symbolic logic that would allow us to put any philosophical question that was a real sensical question into the form of a quasi-mathematical equation such that the answer to that question would be self-evident. And also allowed us to identify places where philosophy was engaged in what another one of their logical positivists colleagues called pseudo-problems. The belief for Russell and many in his milieu was that throughout philosophical history, philosophers have been engaged in questions that were phony questions, that were really confusions of language. All truth was either, as Hume put it, matters of fact or matters of logic, right? You had empirical truths, and then you had essentially mathematical truths, but you had the kind of logical processes by which empirical truths could be arranged to arrive at other truths. And anything that didn't fall into either of those categories could safely be set aside as nonsense, as basically not non-existent. So that was Russell, and Wittgenstein seems to be following in his path, and Russell certainly understood him to be. But Wittgenstein was very influenced by Schopenhauer, among others, and took this mystical turn, where essentially what he came to believe is that once you had done this work of separating the real problems from the pseudo problems, and then showing that the real problems all had self-evident answers, you had solved philosophy, basically. And the problem is that having done so, you still had not touched on any of the urgent problems of life that were the reason that one was doing any of this in the first place. So what he said was that this whole realm of things that you could not say anything about with language without falling into hopeless confusions was also essentially the realm where all the action was. That wasn't the place that you needed to eliminate from view. It's that it had to be approached in some radically other way than through mathematical logic or through the means of reason. So that led to essentially his kind of mystical turn. And he thought, as it says in that quote, that what you could have is kind of exemplars. So the way to answer those kinds of questions that don't have self-evident answers, or that is through what he would call a form of life. There was ways to live out those answers. And then if you were seeking help from someone else in how to live out the answer, that person couldn't tell you in language, do this, this, and this, but you could look at them living it out. And you could take some kind of lesson from it. Again, not a lesson that you could put into words as such, but a lesson that you could then attempt to live out yourself. And so, he perhaps his most famous line, which is the last line of his, the only work he published in his lifetime, the Tractatus. The line is, "Whereof we cannot speak, thereof we must remain silent." So he thought, and now what there have always been, and this included, Kant and many others, there have always been philosophers who have said that the trouble starts from us when we try to use logic to answer questions beyond the bounds of logic or beyond the bounds of language. But what Wittgenstein added was this sense that like that area over there that's beyond the bounds, that's the area where all of the problems that actually matter to us exist.
It's fascinating. Fascinating. You know, this makes me, you probably came across the book at some point, The Women Are Up to Something.
Yes.
I interviewed the author of that a number of years ago, and I remember to what you just mentioned, and tell me if it's misapplied, but when I think it was either May Midgley or Philippa Foot went with a mentor to a movie, and they saw the newsreels the first time they'd seen the terrible images of the concentration camps and bulldozers pushing bodies into pits and so on. And they were, I think, I don't know if it was analytical philosophy or whatever, the philosophy about does the ball roll on its own, you know, all these very kind of well circumscribed, you know, kind of almost vacuum researched lab questions. They walked out of this movie, you know, stunned by what they had seen, and basically said, if the philosophy that we are studying can't answer the questions of what we just saw on that screen, it's not worth anything. So I don't know if that's
so
that's
I have not. No,
misapplying
I have not read that book, but I'm aware of the book, and I believe that Elizabeth Anscombe is one of the figures in that book. And Anscombe was a student of Wittgenstein's and was very, very close with him, and actually translated the Tractatus into English and was made sort of his literary executor. And before she came along, because she was a practicing Catholic. Before she came along, people tended to understand Wittgenstein in Russell's tradition as an analytic philosopher, as someone who was trying to solve these local questions of language and trying to clear away the pseudo problems. And they sort of thought that these references to the mystical were almost a form of philosophical fastidiousness. You couldn't say these things didn't exist, but you could just say, well, thereof we must remain silent. And Anscombe, you know, who's writing about Wittgenstein was very important to me in my reading of him, was one of the people who sort of championed Wittgenstein as a fundamentally religious thinker, and subsequently, because he is someone who published very, very little in his lifetime and just left a lot of notebooks behind, more and more work of his has come to light that has tended to support that understanding of him. It is not just one disciple who has an agenda, who has forced that reading on him. He was engaged in his notebooks in a lot of thinking about this, and he is the one who in one of these notebooks he has that quote which you cited at the beginning that I have in my book, where he says Christianity is for the man who needs infinite help. He thought a lot about religious matters, even though within his lifetime nobody would have thought of him as a religious thinker.
Hi, I'm Todd Warner, managing editor of Evangelization Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3, The Light and Warmth of the Sun. In the postlude of Why I Am Not an Atheist, Christopher Beha describes reluctantly going on a blind date and in time, and quite unexpectedly, falling in love and getting married. He found joy in making his girlfriend turned fiancée turned wife happy. He quit drinking, saying, quote, I wasn't quitting in an effort to find happiness. I was quitting because I was happy. After 15 years, I had wandered quite by accident out of the cave. I was standing in the sunlight, close quote. Christopher Beha changed. He goes on and writes, quote, the change created a strange new problem, for I had already committed myself to unhappiness. It was more than a disposition. It was a worldview. Get out as early as you can and don't have any kids yourself. But what if I didn't want out anymore and even wanted kids? It was not just that I was happy, but this happiness was not of my own making. It had not come about by a heroic act of Nietzschean will. It had come from outside my own head. My overwhelming feeling in those days was not despair, but gratitude, not just towards my girlfriend, but towards the world that had brought us together. I had no framework for this gratitude, nowhere to put it that might make sense of it. Pessimism had finally provided a plausible answer to questions I'd been working over for so long. What would it mean to give it up? My life was filled with love, but there was something in this love that demanded I make sense of it. The light and warmth of this sun were baffling. Where were they coming from? What did they mean? Close quote. So, Chris, this electrifying confession occurs on page 363 of your 391 page book, and it changed everything. Plato and Aristotle, Montaigne and Hume, Locke and Rousseau, Hobbes and Mill, Darwin, Bentham, Spinoza, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Camus, none of them or all of them combined couldn't withstand that four-letter word that had once upon a time slipped from your vocabulary, love. What were you to make of love?
Yeah, well, that is the question. And I mean, you mentioned Schopenhauer, and the basically pessimistic worldview of Schopenhauer, I is probably the atheist worldview that I found most kind of congenial, and it is certainly the one that I found most consistent with my experience of the world, or the one that didn't seem to leave anything out in the way that materialism, for example, left out subjective experience. But what I can, and I still, I can't. It's not to me a worldview that you could argue anyone out of. I can't point to anything from the outside and say you're missing that, right? But the thing that it leaves out is love, is connection with other people, is that our experience of being in the world is not entirely an experience of blind will trying to dominate others. Is the fact that there is a joy to be had in the world that comes from, connecting with others. That this thing that Schopenhauer is sometimes describing, which is this almost oceanic unity, that we're all kind of part of the same thing, that this can be a source of hopefulness. It can be a source of a sense of connection with humanity. But above all, that love could call us into the world in a way that makes the kind of quietism of both Schopenhauer and of a lot of Eastern traditions that I otherwise find extremely appealing, make this sort of quietism feel insufficient. That the world is not something we're supposed to escape from. The world is not something we're supposed to get past. That view, incidentally, is not just the view of Eastern thinkers or of Schopenhauer. That's the view of Plato. That this world is a kind of degraded copy of the metaphysical world. That our job, even as rational thinkers, is to transcend this world, transcend all the particulars of this world to get to the universal. And Schopenhauer, who I should say was a terrible anti-Semite, and was a great influence on Wagner and on Nietzsche and ultimately on Hitler, and his objection to Judaism as a tradition was precisely the fact that it found there to be good in the material world. Because Judaism understood the material world as God's creation. not as a kind of degraded echo of God and the universal good, but as something
Right.
that God created out of love. And it is that Schopenhauer says quite explicitly that essentially all of his problems with Christianity come from its connection to this Judaism. He says that there is a part of Christianity that is essentially this sort of mystical, almost atheistic, mystical, quasi-Eastern part that is the part of Christianity that essentially comes from Plato or Neoplatonism. Schopenhauer has no problem with that. He has a problem with the part of it that comes from Judaism, which is the part that says that this great universal God not only exists in an abstract sense, but cares for us and loves for us, that the world we're in is not just a veil of suffering to be transcended, but is a reflection of this love, that it was created for us, and that we're here to participate in this creation, not to try and get past it. We're here to be with other people. We're here to love other people. We're here to try and understand this world in order to love it better, in order better to understand and love the creator behind it, etc. So those are that's the challenge to that kind of pessimism. And that's the challenge that was presented to me in that moment.
Chris, you write, one of my favorite parts of the book, among many, quote, "The philosophers needed some firm foundation on which to build real knowledge of the world. For Bacon, that foundation was practical efficacy, in effect, the ability to achieve material ends. For Descartes, it was the indubitable existence of the thinking thing. For Locke, it was sense perception. Hume mitigated skepticism with custom. Kant tried to contain it to the noumenal world. For Schopenhauer, the one certain thing was the will, and for Camus, it was the absurd. All these appeals had proved insufficient to me, leaving me with a romantic idealist option. There is no foundation. We are standing over an abyss. But this had proved unlivable, and now it was proving untrue, for I could tell that my foundation was sound. I just wanted to know what was underfoot. So I told myself, suppose you start with love. That was the one clear and certain thing in my life. What would it mean to start there? To begin with a certain reality of that love and build whatever could be built on top of it. If I took this for true, what else would have to be true with it? So, Chris, what did you discover as you started with love, and how did that lead you back to a Catholic Mass?
Well, I think the first thing that approach requires is that you treat love as a kind of metaphysical reality, not as the materialists would treat it, as a just a neurological experience that has been ingrained in us through evolution, that confers some kind of advantage in the drive to propagate and spread our genes. But it also means not treating it as the idealists tended to, which is basically as a mood, as something entirely within ourselves that we then project out onto the world. You have to say that it's somehow a real entity outside of yourself and your mind, which even doing that at all requires you to accept a fundamentally metaphysical view of the world, that there is something out there that is neither matter nor your own mental projections. And so then that's already getting you several steps down the line. And then if you do subscribe to something like the Wittgensteinian view that you're not going to come to a simple, rational understanding of what this entity is, that it is not a matter of having a discursive theory that can be set down, but that it is a form of life, that you're going to have to live it, and you're going to have to participate in something that gives you access to it. Then, if you have already had the experience of this particular tradition of the Catholic Church and its rituals and its liturgy and its sacraments, you might say, tentatively return to it. And in the process, start to feel it resonating for you as a way to, properly orient yourself towards this metaphysical reality of love. And then you're taking certain steps inside a worldview to return to what we've been saying before. And then once you're in it, a whole lot of different things start to make sense that didn't make sense before, but not in ways that you could necessarily explain to someone who's outside of it. One of the goals of this book was that it could be fruitfully read by anyone with coming in with any priors. Some people have questioned why I do not spend more time in the book on what I believe now as a practicing Catholic. And there's a couple of reasons. One is, I had a quite conscious approach of trying to tell the story of this journey of going through these various atheist worldviews. But there's also a sense that there's a lot of conversations that can be had between people who are ultimately occupying the same space that just aren't going to make sense to people who are outside of that space. And it may be that at a certain point, I'll be interested in writing a book that is directed towards that audience, But I wanted to sort of tell the story of how I got back into that space, give the broadest outlines of the contours of that space as I see it, in a way that, people who are not there themselves might, find interesting and inviting. But I was not really interested in getting into the nitty gritty of what this belief entails.
It's funny you say this, because one of the great thinkers of the Catholic tradition, and it wasn't even Catholic at the time, would completely applaud what you've just said, because Chesterton, writing Heretics in 1905, was identifying the misgivings he had with the philosophical or fashionable cultural thoughts of the day. And ultimately, when he was challenged that, well, you told us what you don't believe, but what do you believe in greater depth? It spurred him to write Orthodoxy 3 years later. So what we may be looking at is a Christopher Beha Orthodoxy somewhere down the road. But this book serves, to my way of thinking, as a little bit of a parallel work to what someone like Chesterton was doing, again, in Heretics. So it's
well,
if I may be so bold as to say
that. It's a wonderful comparison. I mean, I appreciate. I'm flattered by it. I would not claim it for myself, but I appreciate it, and I do think there's a wonderful line by Chesterton where he talks about his own journey, and he says that. I thought I had discovered a heresy of one, and it turned out to be Orthodoxy. I do think that was something of my journey. I spent a really, really long time, going through all of these different steps and trying this thing and rejecting that thing, and then arrived in that way that T.S. Eliot so well describes as well, at the place from which I'd set out in the first place and saw it for the first time.
As we wind down, just a couple last questions, Chris. As you write in Why I Am Not an Atheist, a quote, Kierkegaard's sense of anxiety comes from the combination of our intuitive knowledge of God's love and the impossibility of rationally comprehending what this love requires from us. We cannot meet love with reason. We can meet it only with love. Meanwhile, the real source of absurdity for Kierkegaard was not the disjunction between man's capacity for meaning and the senselessness of reality, but that between the magnitude of God's love and our insignificance as objects of that love. We are nothing, but he treats us as everything. And you go on to say, we must leap into faith. Only then can we possibly know what it means to believe. It means recognizing that we can never justify our faith. We can never know. If we had knowledge, we would not have need of faith. Belief is something that we must live out. We must keep choosing it, and we won't know until we are done whether we have chosen correctly, quote, close quote. Chris, this reminds me of St. John Henry Newman and his illative sense at arriving at faith, which is kind of this messy process of scaling the wall and one stone here and then there's another stone there and your foot slips and then it steps on a sure crevice or what have you. Could you describe what it has been like to arrive at and I know you'll never say it's your summit of philosophical knowledge, you're forever learning, but for the metaphor's sake, could you describe what it's been like to arrive at your summit of philosophical knowledge and yet still know you have to take a final leap?
Yeah, well, it's not even a final leap. It's that you have to keep living it
Yeah.
every moment, and I think that, as I say in the book, what I came to realize is that on some level, this journeying is what I'm here to do. The point is not to arrive at the end point and then have that be settled for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
One of the hesitations of writing a book like this is, it's going to be awfully embarrassing if I change my mind, but also just a sense that you are trying to set in stone the lessons from a journey you've been on, the outcome of the journey, and then that means that you're kind of closing the journey off. You're done now, and instead, this is a description of where I am along the way at this moment.
Yeah.
But there is, I hope, still plenty of journeying to do. I spoke about how the kind of this intellectual work that I was doing felt exciting to me. It didn't feel like homework. I wasn't a grad student who needed to spend all day reading Kant for my exam. I was doing it because I found something stimulating about it. It felt like an adventure. And I've come to a point where that's the way faith feels to me. It feels like an adventure. And I don't know from day to day what it's going to be like, how it's going to feel. And sometimes it's going to feel hard, and sometimes it isn't.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's going to really just feel glorious, and you're going to feel like it all fits together and makes sense, and all your doubts have been dispelled, and then you're going to wake up and all you see anywhere are doubts, and you're going to hope that some part of you is going to keep going in the face of those doubts, keep living out this existential adventure.
Chris, finally, given what you've been through, what you've explored, and your ongoing journey, what advice would you give to those who are seekers, whose stories like yours are they're thick with trial, and yet they're hungry for evidence, and maybe even reluctant to approach the Catholic faith? What would you say to them?
I mean, the first is to the thing that one of the things that Bertrand Russell says is that he had set out, once he'd given up faith, to look the world frankly in the face. And I actually think that's very good advice. Now, I see something very different than Russell did, when I look. But I do think that for all the time I've spent reading these books, the most profound lessons I've learned have been lessons from life, lessons from other people, lessons from my experience. Certainly, if you're the kind of person who tends to be someone who spends a lot of time reading a lot of books and takes a lot of pride in all you've written, try as hard as you can to enter every encounter you have with another human being with the understanding that you could learn something from that person, and that you can learn something from that person that you could never find in a book. The other thing is that I think that many people want to generate a worldview, and particularly an ethic or a morality, so that they have a framework with which to judge other people. And I think the most important lesson is that the person who needs to stand in judgment is yourself. Develop a moral ethic so that you can hold yourself to account, and don't worry about who else is or is not meeting those standards. Judge not lest you be judged. So just try to figure out for yourself the way you ought to be acting in the world. And if you can do that to even a decent degree, and then you can live out that belief to a decent degree, you have gotten an awful lot along the way, and you should worry less about what other people believe or how they're acting.
Christopher Beha, writer, editor, and skeptical believer, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thanks so much.
So I've been thinking. In the opening pages of his masterful spiritual biography, Orthodoxy, G.K. Chesterton writes of an English yachtsman who set sail on eager adventure to discover some far-flung land of savages. Once there, he would proudly plant his British flag and declare the land England's and the accolades his own. But in a Woodhouseian spin, Chesterton finds the Englishman dizzied off course, landing on a seemingly foreign shore, and discovering that he was setting foot quite addled and red-faced in merry old England. It is enough to make the adventurer a fool, but Chesterton declares the supreme gaiety of such a fortunate failure. Quote, "What could be more delightful," Chesterton asks, "than to have in the same few minutes all the fascinating terrors of going abroad, combined with all the humane security of coming home again? What could be better than to have all the fun of discovering South Africa without the disgusting necessity of landing there? What could be more glorious than to brace oneself up to discover New South Wales, and then realize with a gush of happy tears that it was really Old South Wales?" Close quote. Well, Christopher Beha is that man. Raised a Catholic and troubled yet honored by mystical visions, Christopher's youthful doubts and hunger for adventure pulled him into the open sea of philosophy. On a ship without a compass or a clear view of the North Star, Christopher zigged into Bacon and Descartes and zagged into Locke and Hobbes. He peered to port, to Rousseau and Kant, and then to starboard, to Schopenhauer and Mill. He mapped a path to Nietzsche and Camus, and then changed course to Heidegger and Wittgenstein. And as the currents of logic propelled his ship, the tempest of emptiness and the waterspout of despair nearly capsized him. That is, until he found love, and everything changed. Perhaps the greatest line in Why I Am Not an Atheist is when Christopher recognized what he could not fully explain. Love is not a mere creature of logic, but a force arising from eternity. Suppose you start with love, Christopher wondered in Epiphany. What would it mean to start there? And so he did, and he found his way home to the Catholic Church, sails billowing, sun beaming, homeland beckoning. Chesterton explains the import of the man who rediscovered his own home. He writes, quote, "I am the man who with the utmost daring discovered what had been discovered before. If there's an element of farce in what follows, the farce is at my own expense, for this book explains how I fancied I was the first to set foot in Brighton, England, and then found I was the last. And I was punished in the fittest and funniest ways, for I have kept my truths, but I have discovered not that they were not truths, but simply that they were not mine. When I fancied that I stood alone, I was really in the ridiculous position of being backed up by all Christendom. It may be, heaven forgive me, that I did try to be original, but I only succeeded in inventing all by myself an inferior copy of the existing traditions of civilized religion. The man from the yacht thought he was the first to find England. I thought I was the first to find Europe. I did try to find a heresy of my own, and when I put the last touches to it, I discovered that it was Orthodoxy." Close quote. Christopher Beha tells a story of wild adventure and the God-kissed comfort of arriving home. Welcome home, Christopher. Welcome home. And one last thing. Be sure to read Christopher Beha's Why I Am Not an Atheist, but also dive into the first chapter of G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy. It explains how he found what was right by exploring what was either wrong or incomplete, very similar to what Christopher Beha experienced. And once you read one chapter of Orthodoxy, well, you'll just have to read the rest. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization Culture Podcast. I'm Todd Warner, and until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.